So first of all, we're going to get started, if that's okay. I'm going to start just by, I want to start by welcoming everybody. I know you're all busy, and so we very much appreciate that you've chosen to spend from now until 1:30 with us on this very important topic. I'm John Villasenor. I'm with the Luskin Center here at UCLA, and I direct our Digital Technologies Initiative. The panel session, the panel event that we have today is one of a series of 7 panels on key technology policy issues that we're hosting throughout the course of the academic year, and on today's is on a very important topic. The format for today is I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction of each of the 4 panelists that we have. Each panelist is then going to give a kind of an opening statement or talk for 5 minutes or less, just explaining a little more about their background. Then I've got a set of questions that I'll be asking the panelists, and they'll be responding, obviously, hopefully in an interactive and engaging discussion we'll have going here. And then the last 20 minutes or so of the session, we'll open it up to audience questions, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of good questions there as well. I also want to, before I go further, I want to thank our event partners who include a long list of partners, but they include the Entertainment Merchants Association and Grammy U. And at the end of the session today, I'll talk a little bit more, very briefly, about our next panel. So let me just briefly introduce each of our panelists. So immediately to my left, to your right, is Stephen Metalitz. Stephen is a partner at the law firm of Mitchell, Silberberg, and Knupp in Washington, D.C. He counsels clients in publishing, recording, motion picture, and multiple other industries. He's prepared a number of amicus briefs for federal copyright and other high technology topics. And he has organized and represented leading copyright industry coalition in 4 Copyright Office rulemaking proceedings held since the year 2000 under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And that's a really important task as the government basically figures out how to implement all these things, and so Stephen has been very active in that. He's been named to several of these best lawyer lists and is very active not only in working with his own clients, but engaging in the broader business and legal community on copyright and other intellectual property issues. To his left is Lee Knife, who is the executive director of the Digital Media Association, which is a Washington, D.C. trade organization that represents digital media companies, including Apple's, iTunes, Amazon, Google/YouTube, Microsoft, Real Networks, and many others. And as the executive director, Lee oversees all aspects of the association's activities, including legislative and lobbying efforts, as well as membership and other issues. Prior to joining the Digital Media Association, Lee practiced entertainment law in New York, predominantly in music, for over 15 years. And he's been with companies including EMI, BMG, and Polygram. To his left is Angela Riggio. Angela is from right here at UCLA. She's the head of scholarly communication and licensing with the UCLA Library. And she's been with the library since 1981. She heads our scholarly communication and licensing unit, which is responsible for negotiation and licensing of commercially acquired electronic resources by the library, as well as in the opposite direction, taking library-owned content and licensing that out to commercial industries and institutions. She's also responsible for outreach on licensing issues, or library-based outreach to a lot of UCLA faculty, researchers, and students. She's been very active in the new open access policy that was passed by the Academic Senate, the UC Academic Senate recently, and she's a frequent speaker at conferences and workshops on scholarly communication. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Corynne McSherry. She is the Intellectual Property Director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is based up in San Francisco. And Corynne is she specializes in IP and free speech issues. Prior to joining EFF, she was a civil litigator in private practice, and she has more degrees probably than I do. Certainly, she's got not only a JD from Stanford, but she has a PhD from UC as well. So she's She's got a lot of degrees there. And while in law school, she published Who Owns Academic Work? Battling for Control of Intellectual Property through Harvard University Press. So this is, I think we'll all agree that even if there's some disagreement on some of these issues, this is an extremely illustrious panel, and we're very grateful to all of you for having taken time out of your busy schedules to come join us. So what we'll do is we'll start by opening for maybe a 5-minute or so initial kind of statement. You're certainly free to talk for less, but if you start talking for more, I might start making gestures that it's time to close it up. And so we'll probably just go left to right, and we'll start with Steve Metalitz.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome to everyone. I'm pleased to be here, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. Let me give a little bit of perspective on this, or my perspective as a lawyer that's based in Washington and works on policy issues, primarily for copyright owners and for publishers, for movie studios, for recording companies, software publishers, and so forth. This issue is this digital first sale issue is kind of a hardy perennial in the garden of copyright policy issues. I think it was in 1997 that Congressman Boucher and Campbell introduced legislation to create a digital first sale doctrine, and basically to say that if you acquired a digital copy of a copyrighted work, you had the ability to in effect, make another copy, resell that one, and delete your original copy. More or less analogous to the situation that's long prevailed in the physical world, where if you have a book, you buy a book, you're free to resell it once you've lawfully acquired it. So that was 16, 17 years ago. Congress decided not to adopt that legislation, and it did what Congress often does when it wishes to punt on a thorny intellectual property question. It asked the Copyright Office to study this, and in the 1998 Digital Millennium Copyright Act, it ordered the Copyright Office to do so. That study took place in 2000. The report was issued in 2001, and the Copyright Office said, we really don't see that there's a compelling case for changing the copyright law to allow this type of activity. It undermines the reproduction right, the exclusive right that copyright owners have to make copies of their work, the most fundamental right in the bundle of rights that they have under copyright. So that was in 2001. Now the issue is resurfacing partly because last summer, the Commerce Department issued a green paper on a number of copyright policy issues, very extensive paper, and this was one of the issues. And as a result, John's timing was excellent on this, partly due to the government shutdown. Some of this activity has been delayed a little bit. But in December, there will be a public meeting at the Patent and Trademark Office where this, among 4 or 5 other topics, will be discussed. Will definitely be available through web streaming, and I encourage you to go to the pto.gov website and get information about that. And so the issue is kind of back on the table again. And I think it will be interesting to hear today whether we think there is a real problem or whether this is perhaps a solution in search of a problem, and whether there have been what have been the developments certainly over the last 10 or 12 years since this was last the subject of public discussion through the Copyright Office study. What have been the developments in technology and in markets? How have those impacted the merits of the issue?
So, and thank you very much. So Lee, and again, I should have even started by saying, of course, we're here for the panel is titled The Demise of Ownership and the Shift to Licensing. So that's the context for all of this. So Lee.
Right. I would like to echo Steve's comments. Thank you very much for having me and us, and thanks for coming. And you provided, Steve, an excellent kind of segue for me. I just wanted to say briefly, I think, you used the phrase a moment ago about whether or not this might be a solution in search of a problem. And just giving a more practical kind of approach here, I think that's largely the case. There are all kinds of thorny, completely academic issues regarding first sale in general and how you might apply it to a digital good or a digital download or whatever. But I think in the real world, as a practical concern, those issues are probably going to be glossed over. And indeed, Steve was talking a minute ago about how the Copyright Office took a look at this back in 2001, and maybe we should talk a little bit about the technological advancements that have occurred since then and marketplace advancements that have occurred since then. And I think that's a very, very important point, because I think ultimately what we're probably going to see, again on a purely practical level, is that the marketplace will probably address this issue by itself, in that I think we're moving towards, and this goes to a little bit to the question that is the heart of this discussion. I think we're moving towards a world that's not so much centered on actual ownership of individual particular pieces of intellectual property, but more towards access towards a whole plethora of intellectual property that's simply available, not necessarily for ownership and for continued alienation so that you can sell it to whoever else you want. I think we're moving as a general kind of, again, practical observation. We're moving towards a world where we'll all probably have access to all of the things we need or want to have access to, without necessarily having to take a copy of them, whether it be physical or digital, and place it either on our device or our hard drive or whatever. And so I think, again, just to sum up what I was saying, I think these are very, very interesting intellectual and kind of academic issues, but my gut tells me that as we watch this marketplace move forward, a lot of them will become just that, and purely academic and not necessarily practical or practically applicable, because rights owners will continue to license their works to people who want to license them. And I think ownership is going to continue to become less and less important than just pure access.
Thank you very much. So, Angela?
I'd like to also thank the Luskin Center for Innovation for having me, and John for inviting me. I'm not sure how you found me, but I'm glad you did. So I come from quite a different background than my colleagues here. I'm a librarian. I'm representing the UCLA Library, which, in case you didn't know, is one of the top 10 academic research libraries in the nation. And UCLA is publicly funded. The University of California system is one of the most highly regarded public university systems in the world. And similarly, the University of California library system collectively constitutes the largest university research library in the world. So the library's role is to support the university's mission, which is teaching, research, and public service. And in order to fulfill the mission, we provide resources scholars need to be successful. We supply these resources amidst the rapidly changing needs of our scholars, which now includes a high demand for online material. At UCLA, the collection budget is fairly divided between the tangible print resources and the electronic resources. And because we have such a well-established identity, we're in a unique position to lead when it comes to the use of the content that's used for educational research. And we're very avid proponents for the broadest use of the content, whether it's purchased outright or licensed. In the context of the panel assembled today, the academic setting has, I think, a more unique place. With regard to licensing, I think the library is an exception to the public interest. I had a unit, as John said, that negotiates the license agreements. We also out-license library content to commercial entities such as publishers, movie makers, web entrepreneurs. And so we sit kind of at both sides of the table. So when we license content, when we become the licensee, the libraries put in a position to having to negotiate to ensure that we keep the basic right to use that material in the way we've used traditional book content, to provide basic library services such as interlibrary loan, to put material on reserves, to include material in course readers, and to enable scholars to share certain information with peers from other institutions. These are the core services that help us define who we are and enable us to fulfill our mission. Moreover, we are now in a position where we have to negotiate with providers to make sure that our lawful fair use rights are not compromised. We also need to ensure that the platforms in which the content is delivered is user-friendly, ADA compliant, that access is seamless, and our users can get it 24/7. We also work very hard to get something we call perpetual access into our agreements, which means should a publisher go out of business, or if we should decide that we can no longer afford our annual subscription payment, that we can at least access the material that we paid for. So all in all, we try to demand sustainable business models and reasonable price increases. So to reiterate, the services that the academic library provides to its users are core to the success of the university. Users may not always access the physical building for the same reasons they did decades ago, but the library remains at the center of academic life. Our environment requires the collection of a lot of material, open, licensed, print, electronic, and libraries are the stewards of that material. They're the stewards of the cultural record. We preserve, we archive for our generation and the generations to come. So licensing is necessary now, but it poses a challenge to our mission. So we need to advocate for fair agreements and to come to an understanding with our content providers about our responsibility to our users.
Thank you very much. And Corynne?
Hi. So also, thank you. It's a pleasure, and this is an issue that I've been thinking a lot about recently, partly in response to the green paper, which EFF is preparing comments in response to that green paper and planning to participate in the process of talking about copyright reform. For those of you who don't know, the Electronic Frontier Foundation is a digital civil liberties group. So what we do is we fight to preserve user rights to access cultural works, but also use cultural works to tinker with, to remake, to repair cultural works. We also fight the NSA, but we're not here to talk about that. So I want to, oh my gosh.
That was the
Can I
NSA.
fix that? It was the NSA. It's okay, I'm not. Anyway. So it won't be too surprising to hear that I disagree with my esteemed colleagues over here that there's nothing to see here. And it's all fine because eventually we'll have access and that'll be okay. I want to say something different, and I want to talk about what I think are the stakes in this conversation about the move towards licensing as the exclusive mode of access. Because I think there are a number of stakes that fall away and that we forget about when we decide that we're all going to become a nation of sort of sharecroppers in the cultural commons rather than caretakers of it and contributors to it. Why should we care about being owners rather than renters? Well, there's a number of things we get with ownership other than the ability to just log in and access a piece of content. If we don't have the right to transfer, we don't have secondary markets develop. And that means we don't always have the lower cost options for accessing content, so it actually can affect access to content for people who can't afford the primary markets. It affects creators. What is one of the main ways that people find out about a new book or music or something else that they might like? Their friend lends it to them, right? That's how I get a lot of books. I get turned on to new authors because someone lent me a book and I read it and I liked it. And next time I'll buy the next book. Let's understand that license restrictions will almost always be a restriction on transfer. So you can't share in that way. But okay, maybe we could have a license that will allow for that. Let's hope for that. I think archiving can be impeded, and I think this is something we're already talking about. What if you can't get a license for, what if you can't get the perpetual license? What if a license isn't available? There's all kinds of content on the web where it's not clear who you would license it from, even if you wanted to. But librarians and other archivists care a great deal about preserving all of the cultural commons, not just the bits of the cultural commons where they can have someone to negotiate with on the other side and that they can pay for. You also get in the way of innovation, and I think this really drops out of the conversation. People don't want to just read books, view movies, listen to music. They want to tinker with it. They want to mess with it. They want to change it and adapt it and remix it. And often, we have licenses that limit their ability to do that. So then they can't be contributors to the cultural commons. All they can do is be passive audiences. Access is not enough. And related to that, one of the things that we see is that content will be licensed out, and the restrictions will say, well, you can't reverse engineer, you can't muck with this in any way, you can't tinker with it. And that means third parties that might want to offer you services to help you interact with the content that you might be accessing, but to do more than access with it. They can't offer you those services because that might be violating the license, might be interference with contract. Another part of this that is almost always forgotten is privacy. If I want to read a book about domestic violence, I can go to a secondhand bookstore, I can pay for it in cash, I can take it home, and I can hide it under my bed, and no one will ever know. If I can only license that book, someone will always know who bought it, right? I mean, there are ways of getting around this that my hacktivist friends know, but for ordinary people, this is not a world you want to move into. First sale actually guarantees privacy. It means that you can get things in unauthorized ways. Again, you're prepared to pay for them. This isn't about avoiding paying for something. It's about protecting your privacy when you're interacting with content and not having Amazon or whomever else always know what you watched, when you watched it, and what you did with it after that. Obviously, it impedes competition. Right? When you have secondary markets, you have more competition. It encourages primary markets to offer you new and innovative services. The primary markets, when they have to compete with secondary markets, right, are going to compete and they're going to offer you more. Okay, now I don't want to go on too long, but here's the good news. I was sort of thinking about the title of this talk, and I would like to assure you all that reports of the demise of ownership are greatly exaggerated. And here's why. The folks that I represent, including the artists, the creators, the remixers, the tinkerers, the makers, they're going to ignore these license agreements. They're going to tinker, they're going to mess with their stuff, they're going to make fair uses, and they're going to share them. So that's part of why. And I think we would do well, and we would do better to think about ways that we can enable those legitimate uses, rather than basically turning all the makers into outlaws. The other thing I would just close with as a nice sort of object example is we should keep in mind that it is very, very possible for creators to be tremendously successful without saddling all content with a bunch of license restrictions. And I would point to, I think, a now pretty famous example, but for those who aren't familiar with it, the example of a comedian named Louis C.K., who made his show available online, the whole thing, and he said, please just chip in $5. He made $2 million in 2 weeks. So it turned out okay for him. And he gave his employees a big bonus. So, and he didn't saddle that content with a bunch of license restrictions. He didn't saddle it with digital rights management. He said, here's my show. Please pay me, I'd appreciate it. And his fans said, okay, we will. Not all of them did. I'm sure plenty of people pirated it, but plenty of people paid up, and he did very well. So that's my opening.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I've got a list of questions here. Maybe before I start, just to provide some context to what I've heard here. So most of us grew up, at least in the era when to get music, at least 10 years ago or whatever, you buy a CD, or even today you buy a book, whereas as I think many people know now, when you, quote, buy a song on something like iTunes or a book on Amazon Kindle, you're really not taking ownership of a copy of the content. What you're doing is you're essentially buying a license to that. And so more and more of the content we consume, or if you're a subscriber, for example, to the New York Times, then you don't, when the New York Times lands in paper form on your doorstep, you own that copy, whereas you don't have any ownership rights when you're simply a licensee. So the question is, and I heard different answers, but I'll ask it explicitly, is ownership of content a vanishing concept? Are we shifting to a world where, for most people, most creative content will only be accessible via licenses, and we will no longer have legitimate ownership? Is that where we're going? And we don't need to move down the line. Anyone is free to speak up anytime on any of these issues.
I think you know what I think.
Yeah.
But I think it is, one thing that I would point out that an intern and I were doing some research in the past few weeks, looking at all the places where people think they buy things, and there's a button, they'll say, buy this now, purchase. Ha, lie. Actually, now click on this terms and conditions of this purchase, right? People aren't buying. I mean, so there is a way in which I think people don't realize that they are effectively licensees rather than owners. But again, to my mind, you can turn that around a little bit and say, and actually that means that they're going to continue to act like owners as much as they can. The question is whether they're going to be able to lawfully act like owners, or we're just a nation of lawbreakers.
Well, John, I think you asked two questions which are actually slightly different. One is, will there be no more ownership? And the other is, will most people get access to most things through licensing and that model rather than the ownership model? I think the answer to the second is probably yes in many cases, but the answer to the first is not yes, because there will still be ownership. There will be a diversity of ways that people gain access to material or use material. And I don't think anyone would want to take away the right of a creator to do what Louis C.K. did in that instance that Corynne talked about. More power to him. That if the copyright owner makes that choice, they should have the choice to sell, they should have the choice to license, they should have the choice to give away their material, they should have the choice to do all kinds of things that are in between. And that diversity, I think, has to continue. The question is kind of what's the default rule, or what will be the most common way of gaining access to this material and being able to use the material. And there, I think it's clear that, Corynne gave a very good presentation, which is almost identical to what people from her organization were saying in 1997 and 1998, when we had the Boucher-Campbell bill, when we had the Copyright Office study. But a lot has happened since then. And we now know a lot of questions, the answers to some questions that may have been speculative at that time and that raised a lot of concerns and fears at that time about locking up material, about the digital lockup that would keep people from getting access to material or from making use of it. And I think the experience of the past 15 years is exemplified in one area by the companies in Lee's group, is that the opposite has occurred. We have more people with more access to more creative content in more ways, through more media, under a greater diversity of terms and conditions than we've ever had before. And that kind of explosion has been enabled by licensing. That's the primary method that's been used. It's not the exclusive method by any means, but it's certainly the primary method, and it's shown the advantage of licensing, of course, is that it can accommodate a lot of different scenarios. It's not just the default rule that you have from looking at a law, looking at a statute. It's something that can actually be flexible and can adapt to a lot of different needs and a lot of different consumer demand.
Right. I was just going to adding to that for just a second. I agree that there were kind of two questions that you posed there, and they're not mutually exclusive, right? And I spoke using absolute terms just for the sake of expediency, but clearly we're not moving towards a world where no one will be able to own anything or no one will have an interest in owning anything. Those people who want to actually physically own and possess a copy of whatever work it is that they find compelling or interesting or worth that will do that. And I don't think it behooves copyright owners or anybody else to try to stop those people who want to actually engage in full-fledged ownership from doing it. The point I was trying to make is, and I think Stephen was saying, is that we're moving towards a world, indeed, we're not even moving towards, as Corynne pointed out by talking about the study that she did in the Buy Now button, we're already in a world where most of the people, in the way they acquire most of the copyrighted material that they acquire digitally, are doing it through a license, whether they recognize it or not. And I think the issue, the point that I was trying to bring out is, for the average person, is that disturbing? I mean, when you first find out that all of the music that you downloaded from iTunes or all of the music that you got through Amazon's online store is not actually yours, all you got was a license to use it, everybody kind of bristles, right? It kind of makes you go, wait a minute. But as Corynne pointed out, I pressed on a button that said clearly, buy now. And I wasn't actually buying because I didn't read this 35-page, 6-point type agreement that said, no, actually what I was doing was I was engaging in a license. But that's the truth. And at the end of the day, I don't think we have this groundswell of people who, upon the realization of that, say to themselves, well, now I'm furious, I'm suing Apple or Amazon or whatever, and I'm getting rid of this whole collection and replacing it with actual owned items. You go on with your life because to a large extent, from a commercial standpoint, for the end user, the license feels an awful lot like ownership. And again, that's a point that I was making initially, which is it's access that you want. The average person, again, there are exceptions and I acknowledge that, but the average person just wants access to what they want access to. Finally, the last point I wanted to make, and again picking up on something Stephen was saying, is licensing it's not like you have sale in one box and license in another box, and those are the only words that apply, and those are the only way we can look at them. Both in terms of a sale and in terms of a license, a copyright owner can do a whole bunch of things underneath that heading. You can license somebody to be able to transfer your work if you want to. You can put those license terms on it. Whether or not the person who acquires that license adheres to them is a separate issue, and whether or not you want to redress that is again another separate issue. But there's all kinds of ways rights owners could license and do so to make a market that's more efficient, that is more price sensitive. You could license limited uses to people for very little money if all they want to do is just hear a song once or twice, or they just want to watch a TV show once, as opposed to a grander, more expensive license for them to have it for an extended period of time, or for more uses, or on more devices. So there's an awful lot of flexibility there, and I think the world will continue to move towards one where there will always be people that do in fact want to own and want to have all of those rights, the highest level of ownership you could possibly have. But I do think that as a practical concern, a huge majority of people are moving into a world where they are licensing goods, they're licensing these works, and the access to them feels good enough for the average consumer.
Corynne, any to add?
Again, I'm kind of in the middle world because we license stuff, but we buy a lot of stuff, and we're going to continue that. Unfortunately, some of our smaller libraries aren't able to do that, so they are forced into this kind of licensing Hades. It's difficult because I know having ubiquitous access to the content by multiple users is really highly, highly desirable. But at what price for us? Because we, like I said, we have trouble fulfilling our mission of preservation, archiving. But we luckily have a lot of organizations that are rising up and getting content from the publishers, who are now the content owners, by the way. Because many of our authors sitting here today have signed a lot of their copyrights over. We have organizations that are getting a lot of the content from publishers and are archiving and preserving it. So if it does go away on one venue, it'll reemerge for the libraries later.
Thank you. Any further thoughts, Corynne?
Yeah, I'm just to sort of push the discussion, because this is super interesting. I hope it's interesting for you guys too. For us copyright geeks, it's very interesting. So I think first a practical point. I think that the idea that everybody is happy or increasingly happy with their offerings or what's available, I think will always be, or continues to be, belied by all the people who are turning to unauthorized sources for content. And I think one reason they do that, well, of course, one reason they do that is because they don't want to pay for it. Let's take that as a granted. But another reason people do that is because they want to be able to make full use of the stuff that they buy, and if they aren't able to do that, they're going to turn to other sources. So, for example, sometimes you can get a license to access a movie and you can get it on 3 different devices. Yay! I have 3 different devices in my living room alone. Like, what about the rest of my rooms? What about, I want to take it and make a copy and make a movie and make a copy and put it on my laptop so I can take it to Europe, and I can't get a license for that or whatever. I think there is still a significant gap between even, access that's meaningful for a lot of people. But I also, so that's just the practical point. But I want to sort of raise what I think is a broader and harder question that we haven't tackled yet. And that is how this interacts with how we think about copyright. Because, one way of talking about copyright is all about, well, if creators want to make a choice to do X and Y, that's what copyright law authorizes them to do. So that's what copyright law is all about. But I don't actually see copyright law that way. I think what copyright law is supposed to be about is a balance and a trade-off where there are rights of creators that are built into the statute, but there are also rights for everybody else, for the public, that are also built into the statute. That's what first sale represents. That's what fair use represents. So when we talk about these issues and we talk about copyright, I think it's really important for us to think about it and start from a starting point that it's about a balance between the needs and desires and rights of multiple parties, as opposed to a matter purely about guarantees of content owners' choices or not. So I kind of want to push that conversation that way because I think that first sale is really emblematic of that. And final point on that, there's been some really interesting scholarly work recently talking about how first sale isn't even just about the statute. First sale embodies a common law, a balance that was recognized in common law between the rights of authors and copyright owners and the rights of the general public that has roots that are well in advance of the Supreme Court decision of Bobbs Merrill, which is the sort of seminal first sale decision, back into the 19th century. So I think that we really need to make sure that when we're talking about ownership, there should be more than one owner in the room, and that copyright law, in fact, recognizes that there can be more than one owner in the room.
So, as a follow-up to that, so one of the, and Corynne alluded to before, one of the broader issues is the health of secondary markets and the existence of secondary markets. And there's a recent Supreme Court ruling, Kurtzang, earlier this year, and in that ruling, the majority opinion quoted from a 1600s jurist named Lord Coke, who was a very well-established jurist who wrote about the harms to trade and traffic that resulted when secondary downstream markets remained under the control of the original sellers of really anything. So the question is, as one of the panelists was saying, that licensors can certainly build in various forms of flexibility, but they still hold all the cards, and it sort of echoes what Corynne was just saying. So by concentrating all of the power at the licensors, do we harm markets in content and in creative content as we have moved to this licensing regime? Is that bad for markets? Putting aside whether it's good or bad for rights holders, is it bad for markets?
Well, let's talk about the secondary market a little bit in the digital context. Because remember here, we're not talking about what Cook on Littleton was talking about in the 16th century, or what even Bobbs Merrill case 1908 was talking about with books. We're talking about the proliferation of the unauthorized proliferation of copies. Because it's still the case that if you have a digital copy, you can sell it. Assuming you bought it, you can sell it with the device that in which it's embodied, or the medium in which it's embodied.
We can sell the CD, just so we can clarify. We can sell a CD,
for example,
but you can't sell your iTunes.
No, well, you can sell your...
You can sell your drive containing the iTunes, but you can't sell this.
But what the digital first sale proposal is to say you can make additional copies and sell those. And then the question becomes, what's the, is it about is it about the right to copy or the right to make additional copies? And this was the decision, the recent decision in the Riggio case in New York, which again just looked at the current law and said the Rubicon that this type of activity crosses is that it's not just about reselling a particular chattel in the market, my selling my book on and on and on down the chain. It's about making another copy of the book and then selling that down the chain. So that's an important difference for the copyright law. It always has been, but the central right that copyright owners have is the right to make reproductions. That's why if we were to move to a digital first sale environment, it would be a big leap in an international, a global set of copyright norms that I think have in general served us very well. But let's talk practically about the secondary market in digital materials. I think there are like three likely scenarios here. The first scenario, which I think is probably where we're headed, is that there may be some demand for a secondary market in these materials, but there's a lot of ways that the means of dissemination of copyrighted works are making that less necessary. I'll just give two examples. One is streaming. Most people, or an increasing number of people, are saying, I don't really care if I possess a copy of this work as long as I can have access to it when and where I want to do that. And I think that's the basis for many of the DiMA companies. It's certainly the basis for a lot of the licensing that movie studios are doing now. And there's certainly a trend, at least in the short term, toward more streaming, less focus on the download market, which is where this first sale issue comes in. The second is the proliferation of what you might call license sharing. What a lot of people want to do, some of the examples that Corynne gave about lending something to a friend or family member, the licensing environment is increasingly allowing that. If you look at systems like Ultraviolet in the movie area, it's increasingly allowing people to share this material under a license structure. It's not unlimited sharing. It may not account for every device in Corynne's living room, but it is, because of response to market demand, it's moving in that direction. So I think that's one scenario which makes this kind of a solution in search of a problem. There's less need for it. The second scenario is what if there really is a strong demand for a secondary market, that the eBays of the world really do persuade most people that they want to have a secondary market and be able to acquire these digital copies. Well, licensing could accommodate that, and in some cases it does. There are circumstances in which you can be licensed to make additional copies and transfer them. Again, it's not going to be unlimited, or it's very unlikely to be unlimited, but the whole dynamic that we've seen, I think, in the last 15 years is companies, right holders, and the distributors responding to consumer demand. And right holders today are making a lot more material available in ways they probably resisted doing 5, 10, 15 years ago. That trend may well continue, but it's happening within a licensing environment. The third possibility is, no, we just go to a digital first sale. We basically prevent there ever being a licensed secondary market, because why would there be if you have a right, if the users are endowed with a right to make these additional copies and then sell them, or further pass them on in secondary markets, then there's not going to be a licensed market for this. I think one pretty predictable outcome of that is that the prices for all this material will rise, because copyright owners will have to assume that the first transaction is the only one they're ever going to get. And that means they have to charge everyone the premium price that they might charge today, only to people that really want a very robust license with a lot of ability to make further transfers. I'm not sure that's going to be in the consumer's best interest, but I think the more likely scenario is that if we see things developing as they are now, I think there's going to be perhaps less demand for this type of secondary market in the possessed copy, if you will, and more focus on other ways of gaining access.
Any other thoughts?
I concur.
You concur, okay.
I'm in a different marketplace.
Any thoughts from you, Corynne, on this, or?
I think
You've made your, okay.
Then let me ask the very specific question. and let me sort of phrase this. We've heard the term first sale. So the first sale doctrine, as you if you don't already know, you probably inferred, is something which is normally associated with the case called Bobbs Merrill, but it has longstanding common law roots. And what it basically says is that the seller can't control downstream sales. So for example, if you, the record label could make the sale of the CD to you, but once you bought the physical CD, then the record label or the recording artist, whoever owns the copyright, can't tell you can't sell it at a garage sale or donate it at the library or lend it to a friend. You have full freedom to do what you want with that content, as long as you're not making unauthorized copies of it. But digital content is not within the scope of the current copyright statute. So one very specific legislative question that will come up, it comes up every couple of years, right, is should Congress take action to modify the Copyright Act to introduce a digital first sale, right, specifically modify the law to allow legitimate buyers, and not necessarily licensees, because licensees would not be owners, but legitimate owners of digital content to resell it. So I'll just ask the question, should there be a digital first sale doctrine that changes the right of distribution and reproduction to allow that behavior to occur?
A couple of things, but before I answer, I wanted to just take issue. I want us to be really careful about the language that we're using here. The phrase that you used a minute ago is you said if a record company sells a CD and a consumer buys it, the consumer has the rights to do whatever they want with that content. Under current
not putting on the internet.
Right. No, but it's important, right, because it's really foundational to everything that we're talking about in terms of first sale and how first sale might apply to digital. Even in the physical world, you do not have a right to do whatever you want to do with the content. In fact, the truth is when you buy a CD or you buy a DVD or you buy a videotape or anything, what you actually buy is that physical embodiment. You do not buy the movie that's on the DVD. You do not buy the songs that are on the CD. You don't have an ownership interest in the underlying copyright material that is represented in that physical manifestation. What you own is that physical manifestation. And you can alienate that. I can sell that CD. I do not have a right, along the lines of what Corynne was talking about before, I don't have a right to extract the content from that CD and then manipulate it further.
Unless it's fair use.
Unless it's fair use, correct, right. Well, but I don't have the right, as Stephen was pointing out, I don't have the right to make multiple reproductions. Indeed, I don't have the right to even make one reproduction. That's an important distinction. And so now we get to, kind of the heart of the question that you were talking about. And, it's talked about a lot that, all of the problems that have been brought up by the advent of the internet and the digital age are the same kinds of problems that we've seen in the physical world, and whatever. File trading on torrent sites is the same thing as home taping. It's just digital and more efficient and stuff. And to a large extent, I agree with a lot of those, no pun intended, analogies between the digital world and the analog and the physical world. But I think when we're talking specifically about first sale, it might be one of the first times where we as a culture and people in Congress have to look at it and say, you know what, the advent of digital and the ability to make multiple, instantaneous, perfect, unlimited copies may be one time where we have to stop and say, well, not everything is just a digital overlay, a digital version of all of the rules that were in existence in the analog domain. I'm not sure. I'm not saying that is the answer. All I'm saying is I think in terms of digital first sale, we should tread probably very, very carefully, because all of the things that went before, Lord Coke and Merrill and stuff, all occurred in a world where what you can do, what any of us can do today by simply a mouse click, was literally not possible. And those decisions were informed by that reality. And that's not the reality anymore. And so, again, I'm not saying I know the answer, and I'm not saying that the answer is to not extend first sale. But I think if it's going to be extended, it has to be extended very, very carefully, because we're really in a different world.
Any other comments on
So
that?
I'm going to be really shocking and agree.
That's it, I'm out.
I'm going to partly agree and partly not, because I do think that I mean, the Riggio case, I think, is a really perfect example of the courts struggling with this and people struggling with this.
People may not know what.
Yeah, the Riggio case was, there's a company that was trying to create a secondary market for MP3s. And the sort of early version of it was essentially you could upload your song. I'm totally going to be simplistic about this, but you upload your song and to a folder in the cloud, and then if you wanted, either you could just store it there, which everyone has sort of decided is probably fair use, maybe probably. I mean, I obviously think it is. But also if you wanted to sell that MP3, you could do that to another member of the sort of another Riggio subscriber. And what was supposed to happen is that Riggio, when you uploaded your song to the cloud, it could inspect your computer. You gave them permission to come to your computer and inspect and make sure that there were no copies of that song anymore residing on your device. And the idea was, look, you are giving up your copy. It's going into the cloud and someone else is getting it. But you have given up. You don't have a copy anymore. Now, there were two problems with this. There was the practical problem, of course, which is the content owner said, okay, but how do you know they didn't just back up their entire library before they joined Riggio? And that was a real sticking point to negotiations, as I understand it. But there was also the sort of other question that the court really, I think, struggled with more than some courts had done, where they really tried to think, well, okay, but is there some way that this is protected by first sale? I mean, you are trying to sell your music. I mean, let's just say you are a legitimate user and you did that. It's all gone from your device. Is there some protection for those people? And I think the Riggio folks were saying, look, we're just trying to make a secondary market for music possible. And I have to tell you, my 60-year-old mother, who's really sick of buying 3 versions of Neil Young every time there's a new device, would be really excited if she could have a secondary market so she didn't have to pay full price again. But and the thing that the Riggio case really sort of highlighted, and I think this is what we're talking about here, is that when you're talking about digital content, it's just impossible to, I mean, unless you just hand over your USB drive with all your content, which presumably you can do, right? We live in a world in which distribution and reproduction are very hard to separate as a practical matter. I mean, in fact, every day you are making all kinds of reproductions. You go to a website, you're making a reproduction. I mean, we're all making reproductions as artifacts of how our crazy pooters work. Sorry, on the side. These are new technology, and this is how technology works, by making many copies. It's the nature of the beast. And I think that the struggle that we have to confront is that we have a statute, anyway, that was written in 1976 and was famously declared to be outdated even then, right? And I think that one way out, one way of thinking about this, is to think about what is first sale supposed to accomplish. And so maybe what first sale was supposed to accomplish is, first of all, providing some breathing space for people to muck with copyrighted works, just like fair use does. But maybe also first sale is organized around the notion that people should only be able to access one copy. There should only be one accessible copy of the work at a time. And maybe one way of thinking about where we should go with first sale is not to just give people authority to make 20 copies for the price of one and sell them, which I think is not what anybody would support. But rather, we're going to support it being possible for, if you have given up access to the work, you can provide access to someone else instead, via lending, gifting, transfer. So for example, if it could be verifiable that in fact that copy no longer exists in my computer, like that could be absolutely for sure, and someone else could have access to it, would we want to have a legal regime that provided for that? So anyway, so I think that we're really struggling with the fact that distribution and reproduction are just extremely difficult to separate anymore. And we have a first sale right that's organized around protecting distribution and doesn't really grapple very intelligently anymore, I think, with reproduction.
I think we do have a legal regime that that can accommodate that. We have it today, and it can be done in a licensing environment through the use of technological protection measures that would enable a much higher level of confidence that you only have one copy in existence at a time. But that depends on, first of all, crafting just what those rules are, which is something that licensing is better suited to do, I think, than a statute. And second, it depends on the integrity of those technologies and protecting those technologies against hacking and against circumvention that would enable that type of distribution to occur. So those are two very important pillars that we have in our statute now. I would agree, by the way, the whole question about first sale, most people looking this up in the Copyright Act for the first time are surprised to find that the words first sale don't appear in the Copyright Act. Instead, we have a somewhat vague or indirect reference to it, which is one reason why this Kurtzang case that you referred to, I think, came out in a way that was so contrary to Congress's intent, and that was probably because it was focused on a totally different issue, not on whether there had been a sale and but on which copies that it applied to. So there's no question that the statute could be clearer than it is, and the courts have struggled with this statute in a number of areas, particularly dealing with importation of physical copies. This isn't even with the digital world, because that adds another level of complication. But I would tend to agree with what Lee said. This is an area where digital is different, and the perfect copy that can be distributed worldwide is a lot different than going to the used bookstore.
So thanks. Before I ask, if anyone has any questions, we're going to open it up to questions. So if you do have a question, if you could come up to the microphone up here if you have any questions.
And John, state your name and affiliation.
Yeah, if you could state your name and affiliation if you have some questions here. So does anyone have any question they would like to ask here? You've stunned them into silence. Oh, here we go.
We've done a perfect job of explaining.
Please.
Hi, my name is Claire Nickerson, and I'm a student in the School of Library and Information Science. And I had a question about privacy rights, because Corynne, one of the things that you said was that the advantage of ownership over licensing is privacy, that you can take that book and you can hide it under your bed and nobody knows that you have it. But then a little bit later in the presentation, now you're advocating this service that makes sure that you don't have a digital copy of something on your computer after you supposedly resold this digital item. Isn't that inherently an invasion of privacy?
Oh, yeah. No. I mean, I think the notion of giving any company the power to snoop on your computer and inspect it is completely creepy. And I think that it's kind of, it really kind of makes your head hurt that that's what we need to do in order for people to resell a song. I mean, there's something kind of crazy about that, which is, copyright law is a little crazy, but it's fun. So, but I think the distinction can be that you can make a choice. I mean, this is where actually I'm all about choice. You can make a choice that you are willing to allow your computer to be inspected, or some folder on your computer to be inspected, to accomplish a particular purpose. I think that's very different from having a world in which at least you have the option of choosing not to have someone know what content you own and what you're buying, what you're reading, etc. And there aren't license agreements that track that, so anyone can have access to it. So I think you're quite right. I think there's an important tension there.
Any other questions from the audience? Please.
Hi, I'm Richard Walpert. I'm with Amplify, LA Local Accelerator, and Excel Partners, VC firm in the Bay Area. I think when we talk about this end of ownership, you almost have to look at it differently whether we're talking about music or movies. And let me explain what I mean. When I bought the Eagles Hotel California on an 8-track, I felt like I owned it. But the reality was 2 years later it came out on cassette and I wanted to play it, so I had to buy it again. And then a few years later it came out on CD and I had to buy it again. And then a few years later it comes out on MP3s and I have to buy it again. But I think the reality is, now that you have stores like Amazon selling unprotected MP3s, you actually have more ownership, if you will, to use that music on other devices than you had in previous incarnations of the medium, whether they be the cassette or the CD or the 8-track, going back to those of us that are a little older. On the DVD side, however, there has not been that same sort of advancement. And the studios are all behind. You briefly mentioned ultraviolet, which in my opinion has been an unmitigated disaster. The average consumer doesn't know what it is. It's 5 years into its life cycle. And, people don't know how to put the ultraviolet DVD on their PC, let alone resell it to somebody else. So I just think you have to look at, the question is, isn't it fair to look at music different than movies, given that music is currently sold without a DRM, but the movies are still very tethered with DRMs?
I'll address that just by saying, I think what you are referring to is actually a byproduct of one industry simply getting exposed to all of this before the other, and that's purely a result of technological limitations. That's not about industries making clear decisions beforehand about how they're going to behave with respect to their content in the digital realm. I mean, really what you had was bandwidth allowed music to go first, right? Those files are smaller. And so the music industry went through this incredibly painful process of watching all of their content be exposed within the digital realm. And now you're seeing movie studios realize that bandwidth and capacity is catching up. And obviously, ultraviolet is an attempt by the movie industry to take a slightly different turn than the music industry did while it was, faced with this rather abrupt inflection point. But I think that's really what it is. I don't think you're talking about anything either culturally and certainly not legally, I don't think. Really what you're just talking about is the practical application of the fact that music just went first because the files were smaller and they could be accessed first.
I think probably what both sectors have in common now is this move toward subscription and towards streaming, and perhaps away from transferring a copy. I mean, I don't know if that trend is going to continue, but the whole idea of the cloud and that this would be the medium for accessing this, again, suggests that the need to possess a copy of it is perhaps diminishing for both.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Any other? Yes. Got another person coming up here.
Hi there, I'm Julie. I'm a student in the School of Information Studies at UCLA here. And my question also concerns DRM. Stephen, you mentioned that we do have these technological measures that you can put in place to make sure that first sale integrity remains intact in the digital space. But I have two questions about DRM. One is, even if it can help to protect first sale doctrine, and this is a question for all of you, what does that do for fair use? Because if there are different uses that you want to apply to a piece that you actually do own, but that is protected by digital rights management, what room is there for innovation then? And second, with DRM, are we moving towards, in much the same way that we might be moving towards licensing more than ownership, are we moving towards a world where copyright is governed not by law, but by code?
So, DRM. DRM is a problem. DRM is a big problem but DRM is a problem for fair use, setting aside for sale. I mean, I think that it would be kind of funny if we could rescue for sale via DRM, only we'll lose fair use. Oh, great. That's not a trade-off I think we should accept. But the reason DRM is such a problem is actually not because people can't break it. Trust me, my people can break it. And lots of other people can break it. Everyone knows that. That's not the problem. The problem is that it's illegal to break it and it's illegal to tell other people how. Because we have Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And that also, even in itself, is not per se the problem. The problem is that even if you break it for lawful reasons, that's the problem, is that you have to break the law in order to do something legal, right? You have to break 1201, right? If you break short version is if you break encryption, if you break the DRM, even if you're doing so in order to engage in a fair use, like ripping a DVD so you can extract a small sample from it to put in your remix video, that is a violation of 1201. Now that example that I just gave you is actually currently not a violation of 1201 because EFF went to the Copyright Office twice and said, can we please have an exemption from 1201 for these uses? 1201 has this exemption process that's supposed to provide some breathing room. The problem is it's enormously burdensome to get these exemptions, and every time you get them, it'll, okay, well, that applies to this use, but it doesn't apply to this use over here, and this use over here, and this use over here. So the problem is in DRM, the problem is and the problem isn't code. The problem is code backed by law that prevents us from doing things that are otherwise lawful. And so, we sort of put in this really unfortunate, legal layer that just gets in the way. I mean, when I talk to people and I tell them, they say, well, no, but I bought the DVD. I bought 3 versions of the DVD. I'm a huge fan. I bought every version that there is, and I just want to make my little remix video. And I have to say, well, hopefully our exemption will get renewed, so you get to keep doing that. And that strikes them as crazy because they feel like they're doing something lawful and that should be permitted, and they don't understand why they're not allowed to do it. And the last thing, then I'll get off my soapbox, I'm sorry. But you did give me an opening. The other problem is getting back to the thing I said first, is that the DRM always gets broken. So you end up having, it seems to me, an enormous amount of collateral damage in impeding the law-abiding people, right? The law-abiding folks who aren't the pirates. They're the folks who are saying, no, I don't want to break the law. I just want to do something I think is lawful. And why do I have to go to the Library of Congress and get special permission to be able to do that? That's really, it seems to me, where copyright law has gone pretty far awry.
Well, naturally enough, I disagree with most of what Corynne had to say. And we've tussled over this in the DMCA rulemaking. Actually, there have been 5 of them now, not 4.
On your bio, it said 4.
I guess we need to update there. But I think, in general, the ability, and I won't say DRM is, it's not whether DRM is a success or not, it's the ability of copyright owners, if they choose, and some don't, to use these types of technologies to control access to their material or copying of their material. I think it's been a huge success because I think it is what undergirds the entire system we have now, the new systems of distribution and dissemination of copyrighted material. We would not have any of this stuff, material in the cloud if anybody could get into the cloud, if access to the cloud were totally unregulated. So you have some way of deciding who gets access to what's in the cloud. That's what enables the cloud to happen. That's what enables the cloud to be the source of all of this creative material and the means for accessing it. And there are built into the statute some degrees of flexibility. There are exceptions in the statute itself, and as Corynne noted, there's a process for recognizing additional exceptions. So I think on the whole, it's been very successful in terms of getting more people more access to more material in more ways, and with the ability to do more with it in many cases than they had before.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Anyone else? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Vincent Marcy. I'm with 20th Century Fox, so representing one studio here. And the problem we have is there is less value for the copyright owner in a system that is purely a system of subscription or rental. And it feels to us that there needs to be some ownership component, even in the new world of licensing, for it to continue to work for the content creator and the content owner. And so we've been asking ourselves a lot of questions about that. And it feels like ownership, we're using lots of words like possess and cherish. There's a lot of psychological aspect into ownership that have to do with more than just a usage or fair use. It's very much a psychological aspect. What you own defines you. You can show it on your shelf. You can pass it down to your children. There are lots of psychological value to it. And so my question to you is, do you think that the forces of market that you are describing that are going to kind of eradicate ownership could recreate ownership or a new version of something similar to ownership? So ownership would be like a premium version of a license. You have the simple usage, you've got like the better usage, and you've got ownership, which is the most premium version. Feels to me that those could cohabitate, in the future. That even if one media like music seems to be moving from physical and to digital ownership, and now with Spotify and the likes into pure subscription, that tends to be replacing the prior model. That maybe for some other media like books or movies, there could be the cohabitation of all those models in the future. That's my question to you.
We actually have a version of that we can purchase ebooks outright, but yet they're hosted by the publisher or by the vendor, and you pay an annual maintenance type fee. So we actually can buy database content and ebook content, depending on the content.
Yep.
But sure. So we're doing a version of that.
So do you actually buy it? I mean, what?
You purchase it outright, but yet you don't really take physical ownership of it, right? You let it reside on their servers.
So if their servers shut down?
You're paying an annual access fee for that maintenance. But that's why we get the clauses in the agreements to hopefully be able to take a copy of it if we need to.
I would agree there's a space for ownership here, and whether it'll be a niche market or whether in some areas it might be a broader market. I think as we discussed before, I don't think it's going away, but it may well be for some types of works anyway more of a niche than the norm.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, please. We'll back, and just in the interest of time, we'll just do these two more, the two gentlemen who have just indicated.
Just a simple question. So way back when we had cassette tapes and VHS tapes, we could make copies of those. Were we supposed to license them back then as well?
I think they were sold.
You're supposed to buy the copy of the cassette and not make and sell other copies.
Well, yeah, you weren't supposed to make and sell. I think, right, to Corynne's point, not to take her stand, but I don't mean I mean to say not to take your place. Sorry, a fair use. You were always allowed, or at least it was understood, even if it's a gray area and different courts come out different ways specifically on specific cases. But it was always understood if you had a copy of a videotape and you were concerned that it was wearing out or it was going to jam or something like that, you could make a copy of it for yourself. The problem came in was if you made a copy of it and then set up a card table out in front of the hall here and sold a copy of it to somebody. That's the problem. But no, you weren't supposed to license it. As we talked about before, you owned that physical embodiment of the intellectual property that was contained.
And this is another area where digital is different because the second generation copy of that was pretty poor and the third generation was
Even worse.
unlistenable or unwatchable. So that's different from the situation we have today.
Okay, and the last question, the gentleman here, again, if you don't mind saying your affiliation and name.
Hi, my name is Herbert Serrano. I'm with UCLA Course Reader Solutions. So we deal similar to Angela. We license material for redistribution purposes. One thing we are seeing in our office is an increase in e-textbook and e-reader distribution, which tends to be more of a temporary short-term distribution license, which is a complete shift that I think gets overlooked. Because in the textbook realm, when I was a student, you would purchase a book outright, you make your notes in the margins. If you choose to sell it at the end of the quarter or semester, you understand that your notes will be gone forever. However, now with an e-textbook, with an e-reader, you basically rent that for a period of time. At the end of the quarter, whether the student knows it or not, they lose that access as well as their notes. However, the cloud where the material is coming from still has all that information. So it's more of a one-way street, almost like Big Brother's gonna get all your information and then give you access however long they choose to do that. So I just wanted to know if any of you had any thoughts about that, because it's a big shift with trade books. When you buy it from Amazon or iBooks, it's always with you. You don't rent that, it's yours outright. However, with e-textbooks, that is not the situation.
Any thoughts from the panel?
Does that raise privacy concerns? I mean, those
It
are the
does for
student-
me,
are
I
they
don't know if it does for the
associated with
students.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering if they're associated, like, do students know that there are notes? And it's been a long time since I was in school, but so I'm not sure if notes have it, but they might have some concerns about what they've written in the margins if they don't know about it. That seems.
It's another incidence of not knowing that you're agreeing to these terms.
Right,
Right.
that's
Well-
true, they
Clicking
probably have no
through.
idea.
You brought up the idea that it's the concept of ownership versus licensing is purely academic, but this is one of those
Mhm.
instances where it comes to a head because the model has always been when you buy a textbook, that's yours. Then when you buy a trade ebook, that's technically yours, even though you're licensing it. But when it comes to e-textbooks, that's kind of caught in this weird void that always gets overlooked. And we do work with lower level schools, lower grade levels, and these students are only experiencing e-textbooks. So it's this huge shift in what's going to happen in 10 years.
Yeah, I think you're talking about something that is kind of an important element of everything that we've been discussing here, but, and I appreciate the fact that you've given the opportunity to actually address it directly. You know, Corynne was talking before about how some of her constituents feel like when they want to just make a remix of something, they feel like they're not doing anything illegal, and they don't understand why they might not be able to rip a DVD and take a piece out of it and reuse it, whether or not it ultimately is in a fair use or not. And that gets to the point, without having said it, it illuminates the point that there's a lot of confusion about copyright. There's certainly a lot of confusion about copyright amongst the general populace. I mean, there's a lot of confusion about copyright even amongst copyright lawyers, quite frankly. But it is an important point that I think what you're talking about, and especially right now, is we're in this very, very achy kind of transitional phase, that those old notions of ownership, of the idea that you have this and you will be able to access it whenever you want. You'll be able to go and pull it off your shelf 15 years from now if you want to. Those are long-held ideas and understandings, and the fact that they are changing requires a significant amount of education on the part of content owners and government and schools and libraries, and a considerable amount of understanding and internalization by the consuming public, that they really do. They've got to be explained, because they're not going to divine it by themselves. They've got to be explained to clearly, but they also have to embrace the idea that what you're getting here is a license, and there are certain restrictions on that license, and it's not exactly ownership.
Well, it'd be interesting to know if that, I'd like to, it'd be interesting to see if that license says, and you are waiving copyright in your notes.
Right.
Or
yes.
however it handles that, right?
Right.
Whether that's copyright material, it might be Fermat's theorem, you don't know, it could be really interesting.
Right. But it's an important point that people have to understand exactly what the transaction is that they're entering into, and what the potential, further on down the road and potential end result is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to just give a minute or so of closing comments, and then we'll, of course, thank our panel. So just actually, let me just start by thanking our panel for having very interesting discussion. Let me briefly close by also thanking Colleen Callahan, Susan Woodward, and Christian Zarate, who also helped put all this together and arrange all this. So I don't know where they are, but I'm going to give them their names. The next event in our series is December 3rd. It's on digital media in the age of the cloud. It's sponsored by Microsoft and the RIAA, and we're also hoping to have some other sponsors as well. And that's actually going to be moderated by Richard Wolpert, who was back in the room somewhere and was asking one of the questions here. We welcome the chance. Hope to see you back here December 3rd, and thank you all for coming, and wish you the good rest of the day. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you. Much appreciated.